The champagne glass exploded across the marble like an accusation. Tiny stars of crystal scattered at my feet, and for a dizzy second I thought the noise had come from inside my chest. But it wasn't the glass that mattered, it was the painting. They were applauding a life for $330,000 while wearing my name like a costume. I had seen that landscape, Miller's Creek, so many times I could draw it blindfolded. The slope of the far hill, the crooked fence post at the river's bend, the way light pooled under the sycamore in late autumn. I knew it the way you know the shape of a scar. There was one mistake, a tiny mix of blue and green that bled where the grass met shadow. I had painted it in a hurry, thinking no one would notice. I had noticed. Only I would notice. Now a placard read A. Thompson. A. Thompson smiled from the printed catalog next to the lot number, as if she had been sitting quietly in the back row, waiting her turn. The room lifted the bid paddle. It rose and rose, and when the hammer fell, the applause washed over me. I remember the taste of copper in my mouth. I remember looking down at my hands and not recognizing them, spotted with paint, trembling, hands that had once steadied a brush like a compass. Across the room, Eleanor Price of the Whitmore Gallery stood as if she belonged to the room itself, refined, impeccably dressed, an architecture of moderation. She clapped too, but not with the abandon of the collectors. Her hands stayed measured. Her face, I would learn, was excellent at private calculations. For a beat, she met my eyes. There was an almost imperceptible tightening of her mouth, a misalliance of politeness and something else. Curiosity, surprise, and then she turned away. Her reaction was a small, quiet thing, almost professional, and that is what made it sharpen into memory later. A gallery owner's glance can say everything if you know how to read it. I did. They were playing the lot as new work. They were feeding the room a story. I felt it like a hand over my throat. I lived through the next hours as if I were outside myself. People came to congratulate me, hands sliding to my shoulder, collectors, strangers, a niece who'd come with a friend, but none of them meant anything in the white heat of that moment. My husband Robert had been dead for a good while by then. He would have laughed and called it celebrity, called me stubborn for wanting to stand up and shout. But the man in the catalog held a name that wasn't mine. He held my picture, read by the room as provenance. No, not picture, possession. Later, when I tried to tell the story, friends would say, "How could you be sure? Paintings can look alike. There are echoes and themes. But there is a language to brushwork, to the way someone resolves a shadow. You can hear a person in their strokes. And there is the small human error, the blue-green smear in the grass where the pigment had not been properly cleaned from my brush.
Little things you don't mean to leave behind, but which end up being your signature if you know where to look. 16 years earlier, I had signed my name and changed it. I had been Margaret Maggie Hartwell then, the girl who believed the white canvas was a conversation. I married, became Margaret Thompson, and folded my ambitions into domestic life like tissue paper. That's the story people expect. Promise set aside, artistry deferred. But life accumulates in ways that make us wrong about neat narratives. I painted secretly. I taught myself to steal minutes. I left work in attics, propped plates of leftovers on easels while soup cooled beneath the eaves. I kept proofs, photographs, a small file labeled with my old studio name and the dates on the bottom corner. 2008, 2010, 2012, patient indices to a life I thought lost. 2 years before the auction, the basement flooded. If you have never smelled a home that has been waterlogged, imagine a book that has been in the sea. I found mildew and sodden canvases, the swollen, pigmented skins stuck together. We saved what we could. Frames, some oil paintings that had dried with luck, but many things vanished, absorbed into the mud, dissolved by the very thing that had once been the well of our home. I blamed the world for a while. I blamed myself for a longer time. I pawned, I sold a few pieces, and eventually, with the money for a new heater and roof repairs, I let go of the idea of being an artist upstairs in the way young me had imagined. It was easier to tell myself the truth. Art had been a footnote, a consolation. Years wore the edges off that consolation. My son David married. Ashley Morrison came into the family with the fast stride of someone who had never learned to be invisible. She had charm, an ability to turn small rooms into stages. She worked in galleries and installation teams. She said the right things, curated certain people into her orbit. She recommended me for a position at the Whitmore, just serving at openings, organizing coat checks, making sure the wine flowed for dignitaries. I took the job because we needed the money, and because standing in a gallery felt less like surrender and more like reconnaissance. If someone asked what I wanted, I would say, to be near the work. Eleanor Price had come to my kitchen to ask me in person. She arrived with a card and a practiced smile that softened at the edges when she saw my hands. "We need reliable people for the evenings," she said, and her voice set itself at a pitch that implied she was doing me a favor. It was the honest thing to say, and I accepted the favor because we were practical people. The Whitmore had been good to the city for decades, quietly polished, a place where collectors liked to show they were charitable. Eleanor's recruitment was a social transaction. She had no idea what she was buying by making me part of her operations.
At the gallery, I learned the choreography: hang the paintings, label them properly, smile at donors. I saw how exhibitions were packaged: the catalog blurbs, the provenance boxes, the small lies that don't quite qualify as lies. I saw how names were made. A good owner doesn't just sell art, she tells a history that the buyer wants to believe in. I watched, learning the accents of that world, the archival fictions, the patronage circuits, the language of restoration. Which is why, when my own painting came under a different name, my recognition was a shock that also felt like a slow-motion theft. After the auction, I went home and did the practical things people expect when something unbelievable happens. I called my son. He thought I had misunderstood. I called the Whitmore and asked to speak to Eleanor. She answered with the same professional evenness and asked me to sit for a minute while she pulled up the catalog on her side. She was careful with her words. She said the painting had come to them via a private consignment, that the provenance presented had been complete on paper. Her voice could have been describing a weather system. Eleanor's reaction to my claim was muted, diplomatic, the cool tempering of someone used to crises filtered through PR. But when I told her the detail of the blue-green mix, there was a pause. I could almost hear the polishing of language on the other end. "If you have evidence," she said finally, "bring it by. We take attribution seriously." It was the kind of sentence that keeps institutional doors open, but is neither a confession nor a denial. It was, in the gallery world, a placeholder. I didn't go into theatrical outrage. I am not made that way. I am slow with anger, but not with memory. I chose the path that had always suited me: gather the facts until the river's course is clear. The first place I called was Pete Morrison. He had been the flood cleanup contractor we hired in a hurry. I found his number on an old receipt stuffed between paint-stained bills. He answered on the second ring, voice like gravel, working class, the kind of voice that feels like a fence post in a storm. When I asked him if anything had been taken during the cleanup, he paused too long. "My nephew, Danny," he said finally. "He took things, thought he was helping, left some boxes at his girlfriend's place." He said it like a man talking about bad weather, inevitable and regrettable. I had known Danny's name from the start. He'd been a presence in the background of neighborhood gossip. He was young, helpful with his hands, and Philistine in the gentle way of people who think things without value are free for the taking. I pressed Pete, where, when. He was as vague as most people are when they're protecting kin. It was quick, he told me. He said the basements were full. He said he'd leave whatever he didn't want at home. I didn't think he had much of an eye. He liked old stuff. "And his girlfriend?" I asked.
There was a small intake of air. "Ashley," Pete said. "She loved that kind of thing. She liked to see what could be cleaned up. Oh, listen, Maggie, I didn't mean..." He had not meant to put names in my palm, but he had. I thanked him, and then I sat on the edge of my bed and let the details settle like a stone in clear water. I started at home because that is where my proof lived. I dug through the closet where I kept negatives and photos wrapped in wax paper, the ones I had taken after each finished piece. The photographs smelled like lemon oil and old paper. There were dates on the corner of some prints, the digital imprint of 2008 and 2010, the little barcode readout that cameras leave like a modern birth date. I found 3 images of Miller's Creek, one in bright morning, one in wet October, the last with my thumb smudged across the bottom corner. In the last picture, you could see the blue-green mix, sharp and inconvenient as a memory. The timestamp read 2008. I spread the photographs across my dining room table and sat with them as if they were people. I called David and asked him to come by. He arrived with the kind of polite shock that is better at disguising concern than outrage, a man who had been raised by me and yet seemed stunned that the world contained theft. "Mom," he said softly, and when he saw the photograph, his hand went to his mouth.
He had the decency of being shaken. David wanted to go straight to Eleanor to make a scene. I stopped him. We collect our proof, I said. We do not let anger be our first argument. If we make a spectacle, they will bury the story in procedure. He nodded. He is a practical man underneath a nervousness he carries like a second coat. I called Ashley next. She answered cheerful, sharp, practiced. She spoke fast, the kind of clipped pace that made excuses sound like rehearsed acts. I let her talk. She said she had done restoration work for collectors, that restoration and collaboration are sometimes one and the same in our circles, that things come to galleries with complicated histories. We restore what's salvageable, she said. We document what needs attention. It's how things find a second life. I asked about Danny. She paused. Danny? She said, and there was a sliver of weather in her voice I did not like. He's my sister's kid, she said finally. He helps with moving, light salvage tasks. He brings boxes sometimes. Were you given anything from the flood cleanup? I asked. Yes, she said. There were things. People give what they can. We can't say no to everything. Her tone had the practiced edge of someone who has said this before. She did not deny she had been interested in certain pieces. She did not claim ownership, but she did not arrange the facts in my favor either. I took note of her, cool, unrepentant in the way of someone who sees opportunity as a neutral force. It was a posture I had seen before in galleries. It was necessary sometimes to survive in that world.
It made it no less culpable. A week of calls followed. I made lists. I photographed everything I could. The reverse of the auction catalog, the high-resolution image the auction house had posted, the tiny abrasion on the lower right of my painting that matched a stain on my original stretcher. I created a packet, my evidence, and took it to a person I had once feared and adored, Dr. Patricia Wells. Patricia had been my professor at the university when I still thought I would be a painter before I would be anyone's wife. She had the habit of thinning a sentence down to an essential truth. Her hair had the silvered look of someone who has been near museums more often than gardens, and her hands still held the small precision of someone who had taught herself to read paint like prose. She invited me into her office and served tea with an etiquette I had always admired. She laid the photographs flat under the lamplight and did not make a noise when she saw the blue-green smear. "Do you still paint, Maggie?" she asked without looking up. "No," I said. "I think the world thought I did." She smiled, as if the truth was not new. She reached for a magnifying glass I used to covet when I was a student and leaned in. "There are things here," she said. "Signature behavior, for one. Some people paint their names as an afterthought. Others sign in the flow of the brush. This signature," she pointed to the auction image showing A. Thompson, "sits differently." She explained, in a way she had always explained things to my younger self, the mechanics of paint layers. "When you sign a painting," she said, "you are usually signing what is, practically, the last layer. That signature will sit on top of varnish or glaze, or it will be beneath the varnish if the signature was applied before the final coating. In this photo, the signature appears to be on top of a layer inconsistent with the underlying texture. It may have been applied later. That is forgery behavior, someone attempting to rebrand or reattribute." She did not promise magic. She did not offer a court-ready claim on the spot, but she nodded at my photographs, at the timestamp of 2008 on my print, and the small gouge at the lower edge that matched the auction image. She said, "We can have a conservator look at the piece in person. We can ask for high-resolution infrared and UV imagery to see the underlayers. We can show the auction house these photographs and ask for access to the painting. Provenance is as much paper as pigment." That was as close to a strategy as she would come. "Evidence," she said, "the patient accretion of proof." With Patricia's counsel, I wrote a careful letter to the auction house. I assembled my packet and made an appointment to see whoever would show me the lot in person. The auction house was civil and blandly teen to maintain their dignity. They said they'd review my claims. In the meantime, I called Helen Martinez. Helen was a curator at the Riverside, someone I had met at a symposium years before. Helen had a way of asking questions that made you trust her. She came to the small kitchen of my apartment and sat at the table, and together we spread photographs like a map of a small war. She read the timestamps, the reverse tags on my frames, the thin ridges of aged varnish. When she got to the close-up of the signature, she tapped it, as if that would make the evidence speak. "This is worth inquiry," she said. "Not all galleries respond well. Many rely on papers. But sometimes you catch a trace that PR can't sew up with a press release." Helen's curiosity was the kind that opens doors. "There is an opening at Riverside in 3 weeks," she said, almost offhand. "Ashley is listed as assisting with the restoration component of the show. I'd like you to come with me. We can bring the photographs, inconspicuously. Sometimes being in the room when people talk changes the story." We made a plan that was more art than legal. Helen would be a curator with an eye and access.
Patricia would stand ready to provide expert commentary if we could get hands-on access. I would go as the awkward elder of the family who had once worked in the same field and who had good eyesight for paint. We would not be loud, we would be deliberate. I began to stitch together the threads. Pete's reluctant admission that Danny had taken things, Danny's boxes stored at his girlfriend's, Ashley's, apartment, Ashley's work in restorations, and her comfortable relationship with galleries that preferred not to ask questions too loudly. Eleanor Price's cool invitation to discuss evidence, coupled with her reluctance to act without the right frame of language. Each thread was thin alone, but together they began to feel like a net. There were places where my detective work bent into the ordinary. I sat in my car for an hour outside Danny's girlfriend's building, watching, like a person with too much time and not enough illusions, until I realized that surveillance is for other people. I called. Danny answered bright and untroubled. He acted as if my call was casual. "You looking for that old painting?" he asked, a smile in his voice I could not see. He admitted he had helped move some stuff, that he had stored boxes in the beginning because he didn't know what they were worth. He spoke in the idiom of someone who believed salvage was a kind of luck. "Who had access to those boxes?" I said. "Me," he said. "My aunt sometimes, Ashley sometimes." It was the admission I needed, frank and small, offered without malice. He didn't dream of the legal rope his name might come to be tied around. He thought only of possibility and the speed at which the world will take what you place in its path. With each phone call I made, the story tightened its knots. I filed photographs and email exchanges into a folder on my laptop and labeled them evidence, like something theatrical. I wrote a concise account, timeline, names, basic facts. I made photocopies of the dated prints and had a friend with a scanner photograph them in higher resolution. I sent a gentle note to Eleanor asking if she would like to look at what I had. Her secretary wrote back that Eleanor would be away for a week and that someone would respond when she returned. The deputy emailed me with bland assurances about procedure. I had expected this. Institutions run on process, and processes favor the steady over the alarming. And yet, in the quieter moments, after calls and copies and the threadbare cordiality of institutional emails, I found myself weeping in the bathroom, the same way I had wept the day after Robert's funeral. Not because I had been robbed of a painting, but because someone had taken the authorial truth of my life and placed a different onus upon it. People will take a thing and put a more marketable face on it, and then the market will decide what is true. This is the religion of the art world, and worship is often bought with a ledger. It was then that I realized this was no longer just about the painting. It was about the fact that a woman's quieter histories so often go unrecorded. It was about the way reputation is made, undone, and then stamped into more convenient forms. It was about being visible again. I found, at the bottom of my despair, an ember of indignation that had the old heat of purpose. I called Patricia back and asked what the next step would be if the auction house refused access. She suggested I gather additional corroborating witnesses, neighbors who had seen me working in my yard, anyone who might have photographs of the original hanging in my old hallway. Small things, she said, are often decisive. She reminded me that in art disputes, the paper trail and the paint trail both matter. David found me scribbling lists at midnight and sat with me for an hour. He worries about his mother the way sons worry when the terrain of their parents gets stony. He wanted to be useful. "Do you want me to call a lawyer?" he asked. "Do you want me to go to the police?" "Not yet," I said. "Let us assemble the facts. Let us not let the shape of our anger be the thing they will write down." He sighed and made himself a cup of tea in my chipped kettle, and then, with the patience that comes from years of listening to me, asked me the thing every son must ask. "What do you want from this?" "To be acknowledged," I said. "To know that what I made exists under my name." It was a small request, and it was enormous. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a woman of small, certain rituals. I met with Patricia to go over the magnified images. She suggested, carefully, that if I could get access to the painting in person, an X-ray could show if there was a different paint build beneath the surface. She spoke of varnish and varnish removal, of the way the topmost strokes can be cleaned away to reveal the hand beneath. It sounded like technical exorcism. She said she would be willing to attest to the photographs and to the analysis if called upon. She would be slow, methodical, carefully precise. I liked that about her. Helen called with her own small transgressions of optimism. "I have a contact at Riverside who can pull a catalog from the back," she said. "We can access the shipping records for Ashley's consignment. If she has been restoring pieces for galleries, there will be invoices. There is a paper trail." Helen's voice carried the steady cool of someone who believed systems could be coaxed. She wanted to avoid spectacle, but she had no aversion to paperwork. Her presence felt like an ally's hand on my back. One night, I sat at my old drafting table and pulled my own palette toward me, the way you pull a conversation toward an old friend. I mixed color in the way that used to be the clearest form of speech for me. I found the blue-green smear easily. There are habits that live in the elbows and wrists, and painted it on a square scrap of canvas, not to replicate, but to register. The motion was small, precise, like pressing a key down on a long unused piano. It was the first time in a long time I felt as if I could be myself and not an anecdote. The paint smelled like possibility. That confidence, like the first stretch of sun through a winter window, is deceptive. The moment of conviction can do two things: make you brave and make you visible. I had both needs, justice and the chance to be known. I resolved to go to Riverside with Helen and Patricia. We would bring photographs. We would try to get access to the auction lot. We would maintain dignity. But beneath the dignity, there was steel. I was not naive about consequences. I had lived my life long enough to know that private wrongs become public affairs, and that public affairs have a way of reshaping private hearts. I thought of Eleanor's glance at the auction, the framed politeness that pressed itself into service when institutions were on the line. I thought of the ledger that might show the movement of pieces from basements to consignments, to the bright sanitizing light of gallery walls. I thought of Danny and Pete, and how family connections can be both shelter and treachery. On the morning we planned to attend the Riverside opening, I sat at my little kitchen table and made a list of items to bring. High-resolution photographs, dated prints, the original negative if I could find it, a copy of the Whitmore receipt that referenced the crew, and a short, plain statement of my claim. I folded the papers in an old envelope and tucked them into my bag like sacred objects. Patricia would be there in support. Helen would be the institutional ally. David had said he would come if I wanted him, but he trusted me to choose. Outside, the city had the brittle clarity of late autumn. The air smelled like leaves and the distant, faint kitchens of neighbors. I fixed my scarf and thought of Robert, who had been a landscape man before he was anything else, the way he read light like a prayer. He had once told me that the only honest thing about painting was that it reveals patience. I was practicing patience like a new muscle. When Helen picked me up, she had a look like someone carrying good news and war maps at the same time. Her car smelled of new upholstery, and somewhere between her careful driving and my careful breathing, we began to imagine what a good outcome might look like. The auction house acknowledging an error, the painting being reattributed, a small press release that reads like reconciliation. These were small, public acts, but they would mean the world to me. We parked and walked toward Riverside, the gallery lights warming the sidewalk. People moved like figures in a painting scene, their coats and laugh lines as composed as brushstrokes. The opening was a hum of conversation, wine glints and the soft collusion of people admiring art together. Ashley was there, as expected, moving like someone who belongs in frames. Eleanor was not of Riverside that night, but her institution's influence reached across venues. She had been present in the auction room and would be present in the ledger of how institutions respond. Inside, the show was arranged with the care of people who think in grids. Restoration before and after photos lined the back wall, small miracles of cleanliness. There was a line of small pedestals displaying tools and brushes, captions explaining technique for the uninitiated. I felt out of place, too public, too exposed, but Helen stayed close, and Patricia hovered like an old friend who knows how to read an artwork's bones. We moved through the room, which is when I saw the canvas. Not mine exactly, theirs, but the echo of mine. And there it was again, that movement in the grass, that tiny bleed of blue into green. I held my breath. I thought of the way one small anomaly can change the whole arc of a story. I touched the edge of my photographs like a talisman and slid them into my bag. This was the moment when the private becomes public. I turned and saw across the room a familiar posture. Eleanor, in the crowd, folding a glass in one hand, watching. She was the picture of institutional grace. Her reaction, small, contained, was the kind of thing that can be read like a play. She looked almost surprised to find herself watching me. Our eyes met. Her mouth tightened in a polite line. For a second, the world narrowed to the two of us, and the space between truth and institutional calm. I stood there a little too long. Helen leaned in and whispered something practical about invoices and shipping lists, Patricia's hand cold against my shoulder. I felt like a person who had been apprenticed to patience and was now ready to make a claim with the temper of someone who has loved a thing into being.
If you've ever seen someone claim credit for another's work, Helen murmured, her voice an anchor, tell us where you are in the comments. It was a small, modern ritual, our early, quiet call to witness, and I let it be so. We had work to do. We had photographs to produce and questions to ask. The room hummed, and I walked into it with my hands folded like a small, deliberate prayer. We moved among the pieces, and I kept a careful eye on Ashley. She was, when not performing competence, a woman of little contradiction. She had always been adept at arranging narratives. I counted the way she greeted people, the way she deflected close questions. She smiled as if the world was a series of social mechanics.
When our paths crossed, she greeted me with that breezy familiarity that comes from someone who wants to be perceived as innocent of the gravity beneath the surface. We did not yet speak of arrests or revelations. We did not yet call anyone to inform them of a larger criminal arc. We were still collecting, not adjudicating. And yet beneath all the collected proof, beneath the photographs and the small forensic whispers of paint, there was a line of story stretching back to a flooded basement, to a contractor's uncertain admission, to a nephew who did not see the moral difference between salvage and theft. The evidence was moderate in the way of good proof, photographs with timestamps, witness statements, and an expert who could say with measured voice that this did not look right. But evidence is different than closure. Evidence requires translation into a form institutions will accept, a conservator's report, a ledger entry, a transfer document. It requires patience, and, if you are lucky, allies. We left Riverside with plans. Helen would pull shipping records and invoices from a back-office box she had access to. Patricia would prepare to make an expert statement if we could get the canvas in hand. I folded my photographs into my coat and felt the weight of them like a promise. When I stepped back out into the street, the air had the sting of an oncoming rain. I felt the old, steady pulse of resolve that raises itself not as anger, but as a refusal to be erased. The painting had been created 16 years earlier, and in the space of that long time, someone had tried to rename it. I would not let the work be spoken for by others. We had found threads. We had plans. We had, in a way, the beginning of a story. But beginnings are not endings. They are the thin, bright place where everything feels possible, and also precarious. And there, under the city's indifferent sky, I felt the first true stirrings of a long, slow reclaiming. I walked by to my car with the photograph snug against my chest, and thought for the first time in many years about the blank canvas in my small apartment.
The next time I picked up a brush, I resolved it would be not just to reclaim what had been taken, but to reassert the right to keep making, whether the gallery light shone on me or not. The plan was simple and stubborn: gather more evidence, invite scrutiny from people who could not be bought by spectacle, and go to the Riverside opening ready to ask for access, not accusation. If the gallery mantles of civility could be pried to reveal truth, we would do it. If the auction house clung to its catalog like scripture, we would provide a different liturgy: photographs, dates, witnesses. There is bravery in small, methodical acts. There is rage, yes, but there is also the kind of determination that files facts. I had both. I folded the night over my shoulders like a coat and went home to find the old palette again, because the act of painting steadied me in a way that anger never could. We did not have to wait long after Riverside for the pieces to begin to fall into place. Helen's promise was not the sort of thing people hand out lightly. She had access in ways I no longer did, and she used it like a key. 2 days after the opening, she called me at noon, her voice clipped with a mix of excitement and a professional tightness that meant she was blocking out the joyous part until she had proof. The shipping manifests show 3 lots consigned under Ashley's name in the months after your flood, she said. She moved things through a private handler. There are invoice numbers that match pickups in your neighborhood. I can pull copies, Margaret. I felt the room tilt under me and then steady, the way an old easel finds its center. Bring them, I said. Bring everything. Helen drove over with a stack of yellowed papers and a thumb drive of scanned invoices. We spread them on my table like maps. The dates matched Pete's account. The lot numbers lined up with the Riverside consignment lists. One invoice had a small handwritten note on the margin: boxes for Morrison address, possible salvage, keep. It was the kind of mundane inscription that, when you were trying to show intent, meant everything. We took photocopies and sent them to Patricia. She wanted to see the painting in person. The auction house, jittery and conscious of potential litigation, agreed to a supervised viewing only after we threatened to go to the press. I dislike threatening people. I reserve it for times I am serious. They arranged a meeting at a neutral warehouse, and they brought along images, a conservator, someone from their cataloging team, and their own insurance adjuster. The conservator was a quiet man with hands like paper twigs and an apology for a smile. He did not rush us. Patricia set up a small lamp and peeled back the catalog image until the real canvas stood before us, cradled in a makeshift frame. I felt for a breath the old private pulse of the studio, the same light that had once washed my own easel. Patricia went to work like someone returning to an old language. She took out the magnifying glass I had seen her use 100 times in lectures and leaned in until her face was close to the paint. "Look here," she murmured, tapping the place where the blue bled into green. "The stroke there,
hard to mimic unless you've made it a habit. She handed me the glass. Up close, the grass did not behave like printed reproduction. It breathed. It misaligned in a way that felt human. Then she raised a different instrument, a small, handheld ultraviolet lamp. The canvas took on an odd, ghostly sheen. Under the UV, varnish fluorescence separated the topmost layers from the ones beneath, like a ghost story revealing its stage machinery. "See here," Patricia said. "There's a varnish that ages differently across the canvas. And look at the signature." Under UV, the signature blazed in a way that suggested it sat on a varnish layer inconsistent with the rest of the surface. It should have been integrated. Instead, it mapped as an addition. "You're saying the name was added later?" I asked, my voice a dry thing. "I'm saying the signature does not sit where an original signatory would place it," she said. "It sits later, atop a layer that looks recent. We should do infrared and X-ray to be sure. There may be underdrawing, paint shelving, that kind of thing. But from what I see, someone has attempted to rebrand the piece." The conservator nodded. He spoke in small, careful sentences about paint buildup and resin differences. He explained that infrared could reveal earlier strokes beneath the final layers, and that X-ray imaging could show changes in the underpaint. These are not fanciful tools. They are the slow, patient instruments of truth. He offered to request permission from the auction house to run the tests. The auction house representative, who had been watching us with a professional blankness I now found unreadable, left to consult his superiors. Later that afternoon, the auction house emailed me to say they would halt the release of the painting to its buyer, pending further investigation. That is the bureaucratic equivalent of taking your hand off a hot stove. It does not fix the burn, but it prevents it from getting worse. I slept badly, with a kettle softening on the stove and the photographs stacked on my floor like waiting people. The leak we needed came from an unexpected place, a messenger in a greasy diner on the edge of town. A woman who did deliveries for the auction had been on the route the day the Miller's Creek piece moved through consigners. She remembered an extra car, a young man with paint on his shoes. Her account was small. It did not speak of strategy. It spoke of movement. An extra stop, a note in the manifest that read Morrison Pickup. When Helen cross-referenced the writing with the invoices from Ashley's consignment, the dots connected like a constellation. We were careful with the story.
There are consequences to accusation, and the art world loves to brand things as rumor. We took our collected packet to the Whitmore. I wanted Eleanor to see it, not because I expected her to be our savior. Institutions do what they believe sustains them, but because she had been present at the auction with a measured look that, in the darkening of that night, had become unbearable to ignore. Eleanor met us in a small office behind the gallery's main floor, a place where the air smelled of dust and catalogs. She had the same exacting poise, but now there was a thin edge to her composure. She listened as Helen laid out the invoices, as Patricia explained the signature anomalies, as I placed my photographs with the 2008 timestamp in front of her, as if offering a relic. "We take attribution seriously," she said, and it sounded like the phrase she had once said over the phone. This time, though, there was pressure in the syllables, an institutional gravity finally registering. "If there is evidence of misattribution, we will assist in any way that maintains legal propriety." I watched her face while she spoke. The gallery owner's reaction that the title promised would be a story's pivot. Was it shock? Dismay? Opportunism? On that day, it was a slow recalibration, surprise settling into responsibility. She asked questions about the consignment channel and the auction house's due diligence. She asked about liability, about insurance, about whether the theft, if that was what it was, had occurred before or after the item had entered a legitimate chain. In private, later, she said to me, almost without affect, "The Whitmore cannot be associated with this kind of practice. If truth reveals culpability within our circles, we will address it." It was a careful corporate sentence, but she followed it with something else, a personal hand extended in a different register. "If it is your work, Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, "you deserve not only recovery, but acknowledgement." Her reaction was not the theatrical collapse of conscience I might have wanted. It was not a tantrum nor a grand public mea culpa. It was a slow, public-facing institution doing its arithmetic, then leaning finally toward repair. That slow leaning would become important. I had wanted recognition. Eleanor's new posture meant a space was opening to be filled. When the auction house sent their conservator's initial report back, it was cautious but clear. The signature appeared later than the bulk of the work. The varnish did not match surrounding pigments, and there were physical marks on the stretcher that corresponded to my time-stamped photographs. They reached out to the buyer to arrange for a resolution. The buyer, embarrassed and keen to avoid entanglement, agreed to return the work to the auction house pending formal determination. But by then, the matter had already rippled farther than anyone had first imagined.
Someone in the auction house's shipping department noticed a pattern when Helen provided other invoices. Not isolated incidents, but a string of consigned works traced back to salvage pickups and unrecorded storage. She turned over a thumb drive of scanned invoices and receipts to a contact she had at the Department of Justice, the kind of contact you save for small crimes and larger breaches. I tried not to think like a person who knew the ending. I tried to think like someone building a case. The person who turned that string was Agent Sarah Martinez. She did not do theater. She arrived one morning with a compact laptop and a team from the FBI's art crime unit. Standing in my kitchen, which had become for a time the public face of an old private life, she told me, plain and steady, that art theft is often more complex than the picture on the surface. We follow the ledger, she said. We follow the money and the movement. Her technician, Williams, set up a table and ran through digital copies of invoices, cross-referencing them with shipping manufacturers. Williams was a small, quick man who smiled when numbers cooperated. He explained that what looked like an isolated pattern can, with a ledger, become a blueprint for criminal behavior. They found a ledger in Ashley's files, an electronic ledger, a spreadsheet that had been kept on a laptop Williams described politely as poorly secured. It listed consignments, pickup locations, small notations about insurance, and who had facilitated the pickup. There were names, some familiar, some not, and a trail that led from salvage pickups to private resurfaces to galleries. There were dozens of entries we could match to specific missing pieces. There were also references to a man named Marcus Webb, a name that had surfaced before, in whispers about how organized this network might be. Marcus had the sort of reputation that tends to live in rumor until paper makes it real. We're seeing patterns across states, Agent Martinez said without drama. This isn't a few items moving by chance. This is organized distribution. The word organized makes a certain sort of slow noise in a person who has been waiting for vindication. It means someone beyond our small private griefs had found a market for the invisibility of others' work. It means the thefts were not solitary decisions, but part of a mechanism. By then, Ashley had been informed that investigators intended to speak with her. She read like someone trying to map her own feelings. First practiced composure, then the visible ripple of fear. When Agent Martinez arrived to interview her, Ashley's face moved through a small spectrum. Defensiveness, then bewilderment, then darkening. She said she had thought she was rescuing salvage. She said she had done restorations. She had helped certain works find new life. She said, in the quietest tone, that she had not understood the full chain.
The ledger complicated that claim. There were entries that suggested an active role, payments, notes about relabeling, and communications that read as transactions rather than favors. But there were also messages that suggested coercion and the presence of a person orchestrating the movement, the network's hub that Williams and Agent Martinez were beginning to map outward. Ashley was arrested that night. It was not the dramatic handcuffing on a gallery floor I sometimes see in films. It was a calm, efficient detention at her residence, with officers who had been patient enough to wait for the right time. She was taken into custody and later indicted on charges that, in public records, read like the official translation of a ledger: fraud, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy to traffic artworks. She later cooperated with investigators. She provided names and documents that deepened the ledger into a case. In exchange for cooperation, her charges were considered in context, a legal reality that did not erase culpability but shaped prosecutorial decisions. The transcript that would later circulate in the press would mention her sentence. It would also mark her cooperation as crucial to the unraveling of the larger ring. While Ashley sat in a room across from agents mapping out the ledger, Williams and a group of technicians were following shipping arteries. They started making visits, quiet ones at first, then more coordinated as warrants were issued and storage units opened. In basements and rental garages, under tarps and in boxes, they began to find pieces. Some were ruined by flood. Others had been carefully cleaned and retouched to hide signatures and idiosyncrasies. In one storage unit, they recovered a stack of works wrapped in duct tape so thick the paint inside had the look of something someone wanted to deny. The number of recovered items climbed into the hundreds. The FBI personnel, Agent Martinez included, kept meticulous lists. Families who had thought certain works lost put claims in for restitutions. Linda Caldwell, the daughter of an artist whose pieces had been taken and traded in the same circuit, called me one night with a voice that had the thinness of someone holding on. We met in a small room at the Norton Museum, where the curators were already thinking of exhibitions. Linda unfolded a photograph of a painting she swore was her mother's. She had the kind of patient hunger for the truth that forms the backbone of a reclamation story. "We will return everything we can," Agent Martinez told a room full of claimants and curators. "We will prosecute where we can, and we will work to repatriate art to rightful owners or their heirs." The parents of missing paintings came forward like ghosts sitting in museum chairs, some with documents, some with memories of frames in halls, and children's pictures in the corners of attics.
The gallery calls multiplied. Insurance adjusters, lawyers, and then curators asking if they might borrow pieces for a public showing. The recovery of art is a peculiar sort of salvage. You collect what you can, reweave provenance papers back into narratives, and then try to stitch the story in a way the public can read. That stitch would become the exhibition we later called Stolen Voices, Recovered Art. Before the exhibition took final shape, there were more formalities. The auction house apologized, and an agreement was reached about the Miller's Creek canvas. It would be returned to the seller pending determination. That determination, bolstered by Patricia's analysis and the infrared scans confirming underlayers consistent with my 2008 photograph, recognized the hand as mine. The auction house adjusted their catalog. The buyer agreed, reluctantly, to relinquish the work. The painting came back to me in an envelope of bureaucracy and care, wrapped, insured, and accompanied by a letter that read like an institutional mea culpa. Eleanor called that day. Her voice now carried that strange combination of corporate weight and human relief. "Margaret," she said simply, "we will do better." Later, in a small public statement, the Whitmore issued a press release acknowledging the difficulty of provenance in salvage situations and pledging to institute stricter checks. In that release, the gallery owner's reaction was not merely the cool detachment of a woman who had earlier clapped at an auction. It was an institutional admission that the machinery which made markets can also obscure truth. Two things changed for me when that canvas returned. The first was the small shock of seeing a painting that had been working in my memory now in my hands in reality. The signature, my signature, had been re-established in the official record. Patricia had overseen a conservator's careful removal of the overlay and a report that explained, in patient language, how the original mark had been recovered. The stitched-in details of the gouge had been matched to my photograph. The time-stamped proof had done what paper so often can, anchor a living claim. The second change was public. The story blew up in small and local ways. Art blogs, a few morning shows, an opinion piece in the paper about the vulnerability of small artists. The Norton called and asked if I would be willing to participate in a group exhibition featuring recovered works and narratives. It was the first time in many years that someone had asked me to tell a story with my name attached to it in a public place. I said yes. The FBI's investigation expanded. Marcus Webb's name, already appearing in small notations across the ledger, became a figure prosecutors tied to organizing the distribution network. The agents turned over their discoveries to federal prosecutors, who built charges that placed Marcus at the center of a trafficking ring.
Marcus was indicted, tried, and convicted. At least that is what public records would eventually state. Prosecutors described his role in coordinating pickups, arranging relabeling, and brokering gallery placements. Ashley's cooperation provided crucial evidence. It made public a mechanism of exploitation that the ledger had only suggested. The press, always eager for a single villain, focused on Marcus in headlines, and on the peculiar human drama of a woman like me reclaiming a life's work. But the finer truth, told in court dockets, and the careful, slow testimony of people who had been victimized, was more complicated. The thefts spanned states and years. They involved people who thought of salvage as luck, people who felt pressured by organizers who promised the world a quick sale, and people who found themselves in legal trouble for choices made in a different moral economy. It didn't make the story simpler to tell. It made it instead necessarily thorough. When the Nortons curators asked if I would co-curate a section of the exhibition, an area focused on the lived histories of artists whose wakes had been looted, I said yes. Linda Caldwell and I met over coffee and a stack of recovered images. We built an exhibit that tried to say three things at once: that art is not merely currency, that artists' identities are fragile when markets get greedy, and that restitution requires a combination of forensic patience and public compassion. Stolen Voices, Recovered Art opened to a crowd larger than anything I'd seen in years. The gallery walls were arranged with recovered work and newly commissioned placards telling the stories, names restored, missing frames reunited with their owners, family histories spelled out with care. My Miller's Creek hung near a window where the light felt warm enough to make the grass sing. Nearby were pieces from Eleanor Caldwell, carefully relabeled and returned. The exhibition catalog printed my photograph, one taken in 2008, alongside a statement I had written about absence and recovery.
The gallery owner's reaction at the opening of Norton's exhibition was a public gesture of something closer to contrition and responsibility than any of the earlier small acts. Eleanor Price stood at the edge of the crowd, no longer merely the woman who had once come to my kitchen to offer me a job, but the head of an institution that had chosen finally to be seen as part of a solution. She gave a short speech, measured and careful, about the gallery's commitment to provenance and the moral obligations of custodianship. She apologized for institutional myopia and announced that the Whitmore would fund a small grant for provenance research for independent artists and smaller galleries. Her words surprised me, not because they were grand, but because they were public. She had moved from a distant, private calculation to a visible public position that acknowledged harm and promised repair.
That reaction, the one the title teased, was not a single moment of dramatic contrition, but a slow arc toward responsibility. It mattered because institutions set the tone for how the art world calculates accountability. The exhibition brought people together. Families reunited over shared pain. Some works were too damaged to display. Others shone as if returning to memory. We held panels about ethics in collecting and sessions with conservators who showed how signatures could be revealed without destroying the work. Agent Martinez attended one panel and spoke plainly about the ledger and the work the FBI does. Williams, the technician, sat in the back and blinked when people thanked him for doing what he thought of as only his job. He carried that small gratitude with a private lightness. In the weeks after the Norton show, the Whitmore offered me a solo show, an invitation that was both dizzying and oddly domestic. Eleanor's assistant called, and Eleanor herself later sent a handwritten note that said, "Your work belongs in the public view. It should always have been credited. If you will accept, I would like to curate your exhibition." Her offer arrived with all the institutional weight it needed, a gallery space, promotion, and the promise of a catalog. I accepted. Before the Whitmore show, we arranged for a small ceremony in which the Millers Creek canvas would be formally labeled under my name in a public reattribution event. People came, Linda, Patricia, Helen, David, and to my quiet, complicated relief, even Pete, who had come to the event with the look of a man carrying guilt and relief in equal measures. He apologized in what he thought were the appropriate small ways. I forgave him the way you forgive weather, because it is pointless to do otherwise. He had told the truth when we needed it. Ashley's sentence was announced before the Whitmore exhibition opened. She received a prison sentence. The reports mentioned that her cooperation had been significant in moving the case against Marcus and others forward. Marcus Webb and his networks faced heavier sentences, as prosecutorial attention centered on coordination and distribution. I do not say these things casually. There are human costs and legal realities wrapped into every such announcement. Justice, in the public translation, can be tidy. In private, it is always messy. The important point for me was simple. The ledger had been read, and the system had responded, however imperfectly. As the Whitmore's opening drew near, I thought myself sitting at my old drafting table again, less as a preparatory ritual and more as an honest daily practice. I painted small things, studies, gestures, the minute way light sits on a blade of grass. The act of painting steadied me still. I learned once more to let the brush find the place in my hand where honesty lives. The gallery opening for my solo show was an odd melange of my life's timelines. People who had known me when I was quietly painting in attics stood beside curators who were making careers from exhibitions. I saw Eleanor in the crowd, watching not with the economized calculation of earlier days, but with a measured pride that suggested she had taken ownership of a mistake and tried, clumsily perhaps, to repair it. Her reaction in this final moment was a public embrace of a responsibility she had at first denied in polite terms. She shook my hand, and when no microphone was on, said quietly, "You were always present. I am sorry we missed it sooner." The words were small and significant. Institutions are slow to change. Individual apologies rarely correct systemic failings. Yet the sound of her voice that night fit in my chest like a small, necessary stitch. After the opening, the Whitmore established a small grant for provenance research, as Eleanor had promised. The Norton established a fund for artists affected by theft and for free conservation consultations. A scholarship was created in my name, not a grandiose endowment, but a modest support fund for older artists returning to practice after life's interruptions. The idea for the scholarship came from Linda and Helen, and a cluster of benefactors who had been moved by the stories of loss and recovery.
I had never imagined my name on anything like that, and yet there it was, a small tab of continuity for others who might, like me, find their lives interrupted. The more public outcomes did not erase the private residue of this experience. There were late nights when I sat with the photographs and thought about the flood and about the way the world treats histories that are not loudly claimed. There were times when the press made heroes of certain players and villains of others, a simplification I resisted. What mattered to me most were the small restitutions, a family getting a painting back to hang in a living room, a label restored so a name might be read correctly by future strangers, a student receiving a small scholarship that meant the difference between supplies and none. I started teaching again in small ways, workshops at community centers, afternoons with seniors who had once painted and stopped. The act of instructing was in part a humility exercise. I did not return to art to be famous. I returned to be honest. The workshops were filled with people who had tucked away creativity for reasons practical and painfully human. We painted the small things, apples, hands, the light in a window. We spoke in steadier tones about the ethics of art and the vulnerabilities of private histories in public markets. People listened. People painted. People left with canvases rolled carefully under their arms, like small flags. When the Norton show closed, the Whitmore solo exhibition opened. Eleanor introduced me publicly, not in a speech that sought absolution, but in a performance of stewardship. We were wrong to allow systems that obscure provenance.
"We will do better," she said. Then she left the stage for me to say what I wanted. I spoke briefly about absence and return, about what it feels like to see your hand recognized after a long time of being read out of a room. I thanked people: Patricia, Helen, Agent Martinez, David, Linda, and the crowd applauded in that polite, collective way that felt both private and public. In the quieter hours of the following weeks, I would go back to my small apartment and stand in front of a fresh canvas. The act of starting a painting again after theft and public attention is a strange mixture of exposure and retreat. I did not do it to erase what had happened. I did it to affirm that creation does not belong to news cycles or ledgers. It is stubborn and private, and often the only language that makes sense when paper and reputation are in dispute. One morning, while working on a new landscape, less exact, more forgiving of myself, there was a knock at my door. A young woman stood there, hesitating, cradling a small envelope. She had read about the Norton show and the Whitmore. She had a note from the scholarship committee. She wanted to say thank you for the fund that had allowed her to buy paint for the first time in years. "Your work saved me a little," she said, face lit with honest surprise. "It made me think I could try again." It was then, in that small, private brightening, that I understood what the public side of recovery had always been about. It wasn't only about getting paintings back or watching names get corrected on placards. It was about opening a small door so others might step through and try again. I kept the Miller's Creek painting hung where light could find it, but I did not live inside its vindication. It was rather a compass. Its restored signature felt like a returned passport. The piece had been claimed in the record, but my work always would be in the making. At the very end of the arc, the title of this story asks you to imagine, the gallery owner's reaction, wasn't a single theatrical moment of drama. It was a progression, a glance that first night at the auction, measured and curious, a private, cautious engagement when evidence was brought forth, and finally, a public institutional acknowledgement and the practical act of repair, new policies, funding commitments, and a willingness to be part of restitution. Her reaction mattered because she could have quietly shrugged and moved on. Instead, she leaned into institutional responsibility. That is not the most romantic ending, but it is the one that matters for work that belongs to more than one person. In the months that followed, Art World Vapors did their arithmetic. The ledger became case law in a number of hearings. Marcus Webb and associates were prosecuted. Ashley served a sentence, her cooperation recorded as essential to the broader case. Hundreds of works were cataloged and, where possible, returned.
Exhibitions spread out across museums and smaller galleries. Curators asked questions about provenance they might not have asked before. People who had once assumed that market efficiencies were benign now spoke, in public panels, of the ethics of salvage. I kept painting. I kept teaching. The scholarship grew slowly, in the way small, honest things do. Donors adding small amounts. A gallery sponsor contributing quiet funds. The Norton giving administrative help. We supported a handful of applicants in that first year, and the joy on their faces felt like scripture. Art, I came to believe, is not only the act of making, but the mutual recognition of a life made visible.
When the world tries to rename that life, there are ways, tedious, patient, stubborn, to push back. David came more often after the Whitmore show. We would sit in my kitchen and make small plans for the future. A quiet studio day, a visit to the Norton, a trip to see Linda's newly rehung pieces in her town. He is a man who loves silently, and that steadiness has always been the ground on which I could walk back into myself. He never quite said he was proud. He shows it in other ways, in cups of tea, and the way he picks up a paint-splattered rag without comment. One late afternoon, as winter pulled itself like a shawl across the city, I found myself standing in front of a new canvas and considering the act of signing. There is a ritual to it, the elbow, the angle of the wrist, the pressure that puts a name into paint and into history. I mixed my color, a muted umber laced with a sliver of the blue-green habit of my old hands, and I made a mark that was not an apology and not a boast. It was the kind of signature that says simply, "This is mine." When the Whitmore later offered another show, a small retrospective of my earlier works and the new paintings I'd completed since it all began, I felt something open up that had been before only a small, private door. Eleanor hosted the opening. She watched the crowd with that same precise calm, and after the speeches and the polite applause, she came up and placed her hand over mine. "You kept painting," she said. "I am glad you did." I nodded. The truth is, I did not need the approval of any gallery to do this, but the public recognition, the act of acknowledgement from someone whose institutional reach had once been part of the problem, felt like a small redemption, not because she had the moral right to grant one, but because it meant that the world had shifted, imperceptibly maybe, in a direction that recognized the labor of quiet lives. The final scene of this long thread is not a courtroom drama, nor a crescendo of public condemnation. It is quieter. I sit at my table, the light from the window making a small rectangle on my palette. My brushes are lined up like a small congregation. Outside, the city goes about its patient mischief. A bus stops, a dog tugs on a leash, a neighbor hammers at a fence. I do what I have always done when the world tightens and loosens at the same time. I pick up a brush. I paint a small hill, a crooked fence, a sycamore that keeps its secrets in late autumn. I lay down the grass with my old habitual error, the blue pressing into green where shadow meets earth. I sign my name in the place I always have, not to stake a claim against the world, but to mark that I am present in it. If this story carries anything beyond itself, it is this: names matter, hands matter. The small acts of documentation, the stubborn preservation of a photograph, the patient work of an expert, the unglamorous tenacity of investigators and curators, all of it matters. Theft can be a cartography of invisibility. Restitution is the slow, sometimes messy map that returns the landscapes to those who painted them. If you've ever watched something you love be renamed or taken and felt small and helpless, know this: there is power in patience, in evidence, and in people who choose to do the tedious work of proof. There are systems that can be roused into action if the right paper is held up, if the right magnifying glass is brought to bear, if institutions choose to be accountable. Thank you for listening to this long and crooked story. If you want to hear more deep dive stories about lives that were lost and found, subscribe and follow. There are always more eyes to open, more signatures to restore, and more people who deserve to be read by their own names.